In this episode of Jay Hunto's Garage, the cylinder heads finally returned from the machine shop, and I pretend to be an engine builder. So the cylinder heads are back. Took a while, but I was glad to get them back, and I'm pretty sure I got some good quality work. In the meantime, I've changed the main studs with ARP studs and the connecting rod bolts, also with ARP studs. I also installed the rear main seal cover. Head gaskets were another issue. When installing the cylinder heads, the head gaskets were not labeled front, top, nothing. So with one side I got lucky. With the other side I didn't. So I had to buy another head gasket. So I bought a Felpro head gasket, which is labeled front. And you can tell which way it's supposed to go. So the way you can tell you've got it in wrong is your push rods will not sit in their respective places correctly. They will hit the side of the gasket if it's flipped over the wrong way. So that's how you know if you don't have one that's marked. If the push rods don't go in correctly, take your head off, flip it over. And doing all this before you torque the bolts is very helpful, because once you torque the bolts, the head gasket's done and you have to put another one on. So on this engine, I've got a Felpro head gasket on the passenger side and a head gasket that came with the kit on the other side. After getting all that put together, that allowed me to install the manifold gaskets for the intake, the lower intake. Again, the manifold gaskets came with the kit were plastic, and you don't want to use those because those were a huge failure point with these engines. So you want the gaskets that have steel as their main substrate. These are your intake manifold gaskets at the front and the rear. They get a little bead of sealant on the corners. You want to pay attention to this, and I even put a little sealant under the gasket on both sides, set the gasket down in it, just in the corners, not all the way across. And then I went ahead and put some sealant on top of the gasket where it meets the intake gaskets that go along the cylinder heads, just for extra security. So after getting the manifold installed, I installed the temperature sensor. This temperature sensor is going to be on the back of the manifold right there at the firewall. It's going to be extremely difficult to get to. So after the intake manifold was on, I went ahead and installed the timing chain. The timing chain just gets installed with the two dots lined up to each other, 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And I also installed the balance shaft. The balance shaft I thought was going to be kind of difficult to deal with because I've never dealt with those before. Turns out it's a piece of cake. Just follow the directions in your manual, whichever you have. It's so easy, it's not even funny. Your timing cover housing is pretty straightforward as far as installation goes. Just make sure you put the bolts back in their places that they came out of, and your gasket surfaces are clean. The pulley can't be installed yet. You need to install your crank sensor, and consequently your crank sensor can't be removed unless you move your pulley. That's kind of a pain. Then we have our oil filter adapter that just goes on with the gasket. Clean your surfaces, install your bolts. You're going into an aluminum housing, so you want to make sure you use some anti-seize on those bolts. Don't forget to install this plastic shroud. It protects your balancer and your crank sensor in case your water pump starts to leak. It'll keep the coolant out of this area. So after the harmonic balancer pulley and the crankshaft position sensors installed in the front timing cover and camshaft position sensor, I installed the roller rockers, the push rods, and torqued all those bolts. Because fuel injectors are relatively easy to get to, I'm going to go ahead and use the stock fuel injectors, just change the O-rings and install these into the cylinder heads. This is one thing that cannot be used in a normally aspirated 3.8 because the injectors for those are very much different, and they go into the lower intake manifold instead of directly into the cylinder heads. In the next episode of J. Hunto's Garage, you see me ruin a perfectly good supercharger.